The evening shadows stretched long across the ancient stone pavement of Buckingham Palace. The golden hues of sunset painted every detail of the fortress walls in deep crimson, creating a picture both majestic and imposing. The last groups of visitors departed from the square, their laughter fading into the distance, leaving behind only scattered footsteps and the whispering wind weaving through the iron fences. Edward Sinclair stood there, motionless, like a living statue. His scarlet uniform was pristine, without a single crease. His ceremonial rifle was held with absolute precision, and every brass button on his coat caught the dying sunlight, glimmering like tiny flames. But behind that unyielding exterior was a soul forged in the fire of war. No one knew that beneath the thick woolen fabric and the heavy bearskin hat was a man who had endured the unforgiving days in the deserts of Afghanistan. There, Edward had stood guard, not only before palaces, but also before the lurking specter of death. There, he had seen his comrades fall, had felt the scorching heat of gunfire grazing his skin. And there, he had learned one unshakable truth: discipline is strength. Now, before him was no battlefield, no bullets whizzing through the air, no deafening explosions. Yet the silence of this duty required a strength no less than war itself. People thought that standing still was easy, that these guards were nothing more than puppets in a royal play. They did not understand that to remain unmoving sometimes required a resolve stronger than that needed to charge into battle. In the distance, beneath the dimming glow of twilight, a shadow staggered into view. The man stumbled like a marionette with its strings cut, his sweat-stained football jersey clinging to him, the stench of cheap beer radiating from his body like an unspoken warning. Logan Carter, a drunken fool, reeling from the bitter disappointment of his favorite team's defeat. His face was flushed from alcohol, his bloodshot eyes brimming with frustration. He did not care who stood before him. All he knew was that he was angry, and he needed someone, to unleash his frustration upon. His eyes locked on Edward. An idea formed in his sluggish mind. A twisted smile curled upon his lips. He staggered forward. A storm was about to break. The sound of staggering footsteps echoed off the stone pavement, a discordant rhythm against the solemnity of the evening twilight. Logan Carter approached, his worn-out sneakers dragging across the centuries-old cobblestones. The cold wind lashed against him, but he felt nothing. The only thing he could feel was the frustration boiling inside him, a raging, nameless tide with no shore in sight. He was not drunk, at least not drunk enough to be unaware of what he was doing. The pints of beer he had downed all afternoon had done nothing to quell the suffocating disappointment lodged in his chest. His childhood team had just suffered a humiliating defeat. He had placed a bet, not a large one, but enough to piss him off. He had also gotten into a fight, a missed punch at a bar, a few curses exchanged, a friend walking away, leaving him alone with the bitterness burning through his veins. He needed something to take it out on, something that would not fight back. And then he saw the guard, cold, motionless, a perfect target. A smirk curled on his chapped lips, cracking at the edges. Well, look who we have here. A damn scarecrow. His voice was hoarse, like rust scraping against metal. The stench of beer drifted into the frigid air. But the guard did not move. That irritated Logan. He hated how the man stood there, still as a statue, as if he did not exist. He hated the silence, because in the silence he could hear himself. A shiver crept down his spine. No, he could not let that happen. Logan clenched his fists, stepping closer, his eyes flashing with provocation. Do you not see me? Or is that doll head of yours stuffed with cotton? He waved a hand in front of Edward's face, but the soldier did not react. Edward's gaze pierced through Logan, as if he were nothing. The anger in Logan flared like gasoline meeting fire. But what he failed to realize was that the guard's silence was not contempt. It was calculation. Edward had seen men like Logan before. Men looking for something to lash out at, someone to blame, an outlet for their own discontent. Men who had drowned themselves in alcohol, in bitterness, in failures they could not accept. But Edward was not an easy target. He stood still, not out of fear, but because he understood this game. He had learned it in Afghanistan, when a 14-year-old boy approached his checkpoint, eyes hollow with desperation, hands hidden beneath loose folds of fabric. That day, he had chosen to stand still, and because of that, he had survived. Logan did not know this. He did not know that the man in front of him was not just a lifeless figure, but a soldier, a warrior who had seen things beyond his imagination. But that did not matter. Logan let out a harsh, mocking laugh, the sound jagged and misplaced in the solemn air of the palace. "I bet you are not even allowed to move," he sneered, taking another step forward. Just a puppet in a uniform. A few feet away, a young boy clutched his mother's hand, his eyes filled with worry. An old soldier, George Miller, stood nearby, quietly observing. George saw what the others did not. He saw the patience in Edward's eyes, and he saw Logan crossing a dangerous line. "Do not do it, kid," George murmured, but his voice was not strong enough to break through the darkness in Logan's mind. Because Logan did not want to stop. He wanted to shatter the silence. And to do that, he had to push further. He stepped even closer, so close that Edward could smell the mix of beer and cigarette smoke clinging to him. Logan lifted a hand and jabbed at Edward's uniform button. A soft ping rang out. Nothing else happened. Edward did not move. But Logan was not satisfied. He wanted more. His gaze dropped to Edward's perfectly polished boots. A cruel grin spread across his face. "All right, how about this?" He took a step back. His hand reached for his zipper. That moment stretched on like a taut wire about to snap. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. All eyes were locked on Logan Carter, the man standing there with a twisted grin, his hand hovering near his zipper. He did not care about the crowd surrounding him, nor the phones capturing every second of it. He cared about only one thing, breaking the silence of the soldier. And he thought he had found a way. Edward Sinclair remained still. From the outside, he showed no reaction. His face was cold, his posture flawless, as if the man before him did not exist. But deep within, every one of his senses had been pushed to the highest level. He recognized the signs, the arrogant smirk on Logan's lips, the slight tremor in his hand, the way he licked his dry lips in anticipation. He had seen that look before. The last time, it had been on the face of a young soldier in his unit, a 19-year-old with fire in his eyes, thinking he was invincible, believing he could do anything. He had not survived his first week on the battlefield. Because in this world, there are things you do not provoke. There are lines you do not cross without consequence. And Logan Carter was standing right on the edge of the abyss. George Miller stared at him, his hand clenched so tightly it had turned pale. The old veteran needed no further proof. He had seen men like Logan all his life, men who stepped too far without understanding the cost. But this time, George had no intention of intervening, because he knew what was about to happen. Edward Sinclair was no rookie. He was not a punching bag. He was not some uniformed mannequin meant to stand there and endure. He was a soldier, and when a soldier acts, they never act halfway. Logan grinned, a smug, triumphant grin, the smile of a man who believed he had won before the fight even began. He pulled down the zipper, and in that instant, the world stopped. A cold wind swept through the square, making the flags on the iron gate ripple. A small boy clutched his mother's coat, not understanding why he suddenly felt afraid. A young woman held up her phone, but could not decide if she should keep recording. George Miller shook his head slightly. "You just made a mistake, kid," because the soldier had moved. Not much, just half a step, just enough for anyone who had ever served to understand what it meant. Patience had ended, and Logan Carter did not realize it. He scoffed. "So, you finally—" Thwack! The punch came faster than lightning, faster than anyone's thoughts could catch up. Precise, merciless. Logan's face twisted instantly. His eyes went wide in shock. His body had no time to process what had happened before it was sent reeling backward. He staggered. 2 steps. 3. Then crashed onto the cold stone pavement. His mouth opened, but no sound came out except for a weak, wheezing gasp. Edward stood there, his arm just lowering from the perfect strike. His white gloves remained spotless. His red uniform, without a single crease. But his eyes, cold as ice. Not the eyes of a guard. Not the eyes of a living statue. The eyes of a man who had killed to survive. And in that moment, Logan Carter realized the truth. He had messed with the wrong man. The crowd erupted. Some screamed. Others burst into uncontrollable laughter. A woman clutched her son tightly, but her eyes could not hide their satisfaction. George Miller smiled. "Well done, son." But the story was not over. Because Logan Carter, now humiliated and in pain, began to stir. He could not accept this. He could not let himself be beaten like this. Time seemed to slow down. The surrounding sounds faded, giving way to a moment of fate. Logan Carter roared. His rage ignited, burning away what little reason he had left. He no longer cared about the crowd, the eyes watching him, or the consequences of his next action. He only knew one thing. He had been humiliated. Logan Carter, a man who never lost, had just been disgraced by a royal guard in front of everyone. Unacceptable. Unforgivable. In his fury, he sprang up. His cheek still burned from Edward's perfectly executed punch. The metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth. He had been struck. He had been made a fool of. And now, he would retaliate. He lunged forward. His steps were unsteady, but they carried deadly intent. There was no plan, no strategy, only blind rage driving him forward. Edward Sinclair remained still. His gaze did not change, calm, cold, as if he had seen this play out 1,000 times before. Because he had, in Afghanistan, he had witnessed reckless men charge at his unit, believing that speed and fury could overcome skill and discipline. But what they failed to understand was this: against a trained soldier, rage was not a weapon. It was a weakness, and Logan Carter was about to learn that in the most painful way possible. The kick landed, faster than a heartbeat, faster than the shock in Logan's eyes when he realized he had run straight into a trap. Thwack! Edward's polished black boot struck its target with surgical precision. And the target? Right between Logan Carter's legs. The pain was indescribable. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was not like a punch to the face in a bar fight. It was not like a motorcycle crash on the highway. It was a primal, nerve-searing agony that shut down his brain in a moment of pure horror. He could not breathe. His throat released a dry, strangled gasp. His eyes widened, pure white, as if his soul had been sucked out. His body lifted off the ground in an eternal second. Then he crashed down. Silence consumed the square. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths agape, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Some turned away, not out of shock, but because they were trying not to laugh too loudly. A small boy clung to his mother's coat, watching as Logan curled up like a boiled shrimp on the cold stone pavement. George Miller nodded, a fleeting smile of satisfaction crossing his weathered face. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything. Logan Carter could not move. His entire body trembled. His mouth opened, but no sound came out except for a series of broken, pitiful whimpers. He could not believe it. He was no longer the strong one, no longer the troublemaker, no longer the man who always won every fight. He was just a fool lying on the ground, realizing he had picked the wrong opponent. Edward Sinclair returned to his stance. His foot settled back into place with precise control, not a single wasted movement. No gloating, no arrogance, only silence. There was no need for words. His actions had spoken for him. Footsteps echoed. 2 police officers approached, arms crossed, looking down at Logan, who still had not managed to sit up. The older officer, who seemed like he had seen this kind of thing before, crouched down and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you tripped, huh?" No response. Just another agonized whimper from Logan. The younger officer flipped open his notebook, his voice casual. "We've got evidence of public intoxication, disorderly conduct, insulting a serviceman, and possibly a case of extreme stupidity. Would you like to contest any of that?" Logan only whimpered again. The older officer chuckled softly. "All right then, get up." He looked down at Logan, who still could not move, then glanced at Edward. "Do you need assistance, soldier?" Edward did not reply. He simply stood there, flawless, as if nothing had happened. But the officer understood. He gave a respectful nod before turning back to his work. George Miller remained in place. He looked at Edward for a long moment. In his eyes, Edward was not just another royal guard. He was a true soldier, a man who understood honor, discipline, and patience. And more importantly, a man who knew when to act. Silence still enveloped the scene. But it was no longer a tense silence. It was a different kind of silence. A silence of respect. Logan Carter still lay there, his face contorted in pain. He was no longer the drunken, swaggering man full of mockery. He was no longer the man who thought he could do anything without consequences. He was a defeated man. His eyes were shut tight, lips pressed together, trying to ignore the stares directed at him. He knew. Everyone was looking at him, not with fear, not with pity, with contempt, and that hurt more than the kick itself. The old police officer crouched down and lightly patted his cheek. "All right, son, get up." No response. The young officer smirked, letting out a slow breath. "Looks like the tough kid just learned a real lesson." George Miller chuckled, a short, dry sound but full of meaning, because he knew exactly what lesson Logan had just learned. Edward Sinclair remained standing there, motionless, as if nothing had happened, every movement calculated to perfection, as if that kick had never occurred, as if Logan Carter had never existed. And that was the cruelest part of the punishment. Not the kick, not the physical pain, but the absolute indifference. Logan wanted to be the center of attention. He wanted to break the silence. But now, he had been swallowed whole by it. The officer's footsteps echoed on the cold stone pavement. "Come on, son. The car is waiting for you." They grabbed Logan's arms and pulled him up. He staggered, his legs no longer feeling like they belonged to him. His body still ached, but that was not what mattered. What truly mattered was that he had no dignity left to hold on to. He kept his head down, not daring to look at anyone. The crowd slowly dispersed. Those who had witnessed this moment would never forget it. Some turned to each other, whispering in admiration. A middle-aged man shook his head and smiled. "Perfect. Simply perfect." A woman pushed her young son forward and whispered, "Remember this. Never disrespect a soldier." The boy nodded, his eyes still gleaming from what he had just seen. George Miller remained there, his aged eyes filled with nostalgia. He had once been a soldier. He had once worn the uniform, stood guard at important gates, and faced men like Logan Carter every day. And he knew that not everyone possessed the composure and strength of Edward Sinclair. He looked at the young soldier and gave a slight nod, a gesture of respect from a veteran to a warrior. Edward did not react, but George knew. He understood. A few days later, footage of the incident spread everywhere. Millions of people watched the moment Logan Carter was taken down with a single strike. Thousands of comments flooded in. "Fire, a perfect kick." "Fire, this is why you don't mess with a royal guard." "Fire, the soldier's silence is the greatest punishment." "Fire, respect is something that must be learned. Some learned through words. Others have to learn the hard way." But among the thousands of comments, there was one that stood out, simple yet profound. Soldiers are not statues. They are warriors who choose patience over violence. But when the line is crossed, they also know how to teach an arrogant man a lesson. And beneath that comment, thousands of likes. Logan Carter never returned to Buckingham Palace. He disappeared from the public eye, walking the streets with his pride crushed beneath his feet. But every time he heard the sound of boots striking stone, every time he saw a guard standing tall at the palace gates, he remembered that moment. The moment he realized that some things should never be disrespected. The moment he learned a lesson he would never forget. And Edward Sinclair? He remained there day after day, without a word, without a glance, because he knew some lessons never need to be repeated. Some kicks only need to be delivered once in a lifetime. Time passes, but the lesson still echoes. In the following days, the video capturing the moment Logan Carter was taken down with a single kick spread across news outlets, social media, and even television broadcasts. The headlines flooded in. Newspaper, the perfect punishment. Royal Guard brutally takes down a drunken fool. Newspaper, never provoke a guard. A harsh lesson for the arrogant. Newspaper, when patience has limits. Logan Carter learns a lifelong lesson. People rewound the moment again and again. Logan's aggression, Edward's patience, and then the perfectly executed kick. Fire millions of views, thousands of comments. Fire a moment turned into legend. But amidst the noise of the crowd, one man remained silent. Edward Sinclair. After his arrest, Logan Carter was fined for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and insulting a soldier. But the real punishment was not the money he had to pay. It was the honor he had lost. He no longer dared to appear in public. Wherever he went, people stared. They did not need to say anything. But he knew. They had seen the video. They had witnessed the moment he was defeated. And that was more painful than any punishment. Logan had once been the kind of man who loved attention, who thrived in the spotlight, who wanted to be the center of it all. But now, he only wanted to disappear. Every day, hundreds of tourists passed through the gates of Buckingham Palace. They stopped, watching the royal guards whispering about the famous story. Some looked at Edward Sinclair with admiration. Some looked at him with caution. But he did not look back at anyone, because he did not need attention. He did not do it to be praised. He simply did what had to be done. And then, on an autumn afternoon, a man appeared. George Miller. His old suit was still neatly worn. The medals on his chest remained, a mark of wartime, of battles that the younger generation had long forgotten. He stood there, silently observing Edward. No one knew when he had arrived. No one noticed as he stepped forward. But Edward did. They did not need words. A single look, and they understood each other. Then George Miller raised his hand, not in a casual salute, but in the salute of a soldier. An act that only those who had fought, who had faced death, who truly understood the meaning of discipline and honor could perform. Edward stood there, looking at the old veteran. He did not move. He did not smile. But he raised his hand in return. A perfect salute. A soldier greeting a soldier. A moment no one in the crowd could comprehend. But for the two of them, it meant everything. Time passes. Everything eventually settles down. The articles stop mentioning Logan Carter. The mocking videos gradually get replaced by new headlines. But there is one thing that never fades. The lesson. A lesson about respect, about discipline, about honor, and most importantly, about silence. The consequence is not just the pain that lingered for weeks in Logan Carter's body. Not just the looks of disdain every time he stepped outside. Not just the quiet disappearance from the vibrant life he once loved. The real consequence was realization. For the first time in his life, Logan was forced to look at himself. He had always believed that power lay in noise, in shouting, in appearing more intimidating than others. He thought that to be respected, he had to instill fear. But he was defeated by a man who never spoke a word, by a soldier who simply stood still. It turned out that true strength did not lie in noise. It lay in patience, in discipline, in the ability to control oneself. And Logan Carter learned that, in the most painful way, for him, nothing changed. Every day, he stood there, motionless, silently guarding the gates of history. But the people who passed by no longer looked at him the way they once did. They no longer saw a statue. They saw a warrior, a living, breathing man with a past, with discipline, with unwavering loyalty. And in their eyes, there was respect, not because of the kick, but because of the patience to wait for the moment that truly mattered. Because that is the mark of a real soldier. One winter morning, George Miller returned. He stood there, quietly observing Edward, just like before. This time, there was no crowd, no chaos, just an old soldier and a young one. George knew his time was running out. He had seen too much in his life. War, loss, sacrifice. And in Edward, he saw a new generation, one that still upheld honor and discipline, even as the world changed. Not everyone had forgotten the value of respect. Not everyone bowed to chaos. And he smiled because he knew the legacy of soldiers like him still lived on. This story is not just about a kick, not just about a drunkard and a guard. It is about the fine line between patience and reaction, about the respect that some believe they can trample without consequence, and about silence, a weapon far more powerful than any words. Because sometimes you do not need to shout to show strength. You just need to stand still and wait for the right moment. And when that moment comes, your actions will speak louder than anything else. Fire, what do you think about this lesson? Fire is silence, a strength that many people fail to recognize. Fire, have you ever been in a situation where patience was the best answer? Fire, share your thoughts in the comments below. Fire, and remember, respect is not an option. It is a principle.